Wominjeka and good afternoon. Wherever you are today and wherever you work, live and play, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country each of us is meeting on. For me here in Naarm, that is Bunurong, Wiradjuri and Wadawurrung people. We recognise your continuing connection to the land and waters, acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on this land and commit to building a brighter future together. My name is Sharon Braun and I'm an Associate Director of Programming with CEDA. I am pleased to welcome you to today's live stream discussion on how Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians can work together to ensure that our lands and waterways sustain us for generations to come. As a nation, we continue to confront the challenges of climate change. We hope today's discussion offers valuable insights into how the deep generational knowledge of First Nations people rooted in working and caring for country can support efforts to mitigate the impacts of climate change on our continent. As always, the opportunity to actively participate in today's conversation is a mainstay of CEDA's forums. Follow CEDA across our social media channels and add your comments and key takeaways using the hashtag First Nations. Put your questions to the panel via our Pigeonhole app, which is available just below the live stream window on your screen, or log in on your devices by entering the URL ceda.pigeonhole.at and enter using the password First Nations. We will endeavour to ask as many of your questions as time allows, but to help us understand those questions with the broadest interest, please review and vote on the questions entered by your fellow participants. Please also take a moment at the end of the live stream to rate your experience of today's discussion in Pigeonhole. Before we kick things off, I'd like to thank the South Australian Department for Environment and Water for their support of today's live stream. The department has a long history of working with First Nations and working in partnership with First Peoples in areas such as co-management of protected areas, water resource management, fire management, ranger employment, training and broader natural resources and conservation initiatives. These partnerships recognise First Nations rights, interests and obligations to speak for their country, support First Nations connection to country and adhere to the terms of the agreements between Aboriginal nations and South Australian or Australian governments under a general principle of inclusiveness. We greatly appreciate the ongoing support of the South Australian Government in CEDA's work and particularly today the Department of Environment and Water, which has been a valued CEDA member since 2015. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our facilitator for today's discussion. We are delighted to have Jason Irving, Director of the National Parks and Wildlife Service in South Australia, to the CEDA stage. His lifelong dedication to nature and the environment has profoundly shaped his career, and he and his team are leading discussions with traditional owners as part of the World Heritage bid for the Flinders Ranges, as well as working with traditional owners to better protect significant cultural sites such as Cunalda Cave in the state's far west. Jason, thank you for participating in today's live stream and driving the ship. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon, and hello, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to pay my respects to the Kaurna people on whose country I'm meeting today. Pay my very deep respects to Elders past, present and emerging. Always was and always will be Kaurna country. In South Australia, we're very fortunate that we've got a very large national park system, over 400 parks, but we're even more fortunate that in that 20 million hectares, which is about 20% of our state, that over 3/4 of that area is co-managed with First Nations groups. So we're very proud of that. The co-management is a journey, it's not an endpoint, and the more I think we're doing well in it, the more I know we've got more to do. South Australia is fortunate. We do have a number of firsts, which people may or may not be aware of, and which I briefly do want to share with you. One of those is the first land rights legislation was established in South Australia in the 1970s. In addition to that, the very first Indigenous protected area was established in South Australia, and that's an incredible national program now. And of course, as many of you will be aware, that the first voice to Parliament was set up here in South Australia, and that's starting to get some traction now, which we're very proud of. So that's enough on me and the great things we're doing in South Australia, because we're really fortunate to have three fantastic people joining us today for the panel conversation, doing great things around the country, both within their communities and sharing that knowledge with other communities. So we've got 3 people. One of those is Leon Donovan, who is the Regional Manager, Eastern New South Wales for the National Indigenous Australians Agency. We have Victor Steffensen, who is co-founder and lead fire practitioner for Firesticks. And we have Dr. Glenn Woods, who's CEO of Martuwarra Fitzroy River Council. So I'd like you all to virtually join me in thanking them for joining us today. Very thankful that they've made time in their very busy schedules. So for today's format, as Sharon mentioned before, we've got a process for questions. So everyone should have a link and passcode details on their live stream to be able to post questions, and I'll be looking to get through as many of those as we can, but I'm sure that we'll have lots of questions and we'll do the best we can. But first and foremost, we will be kicking off with a bit of a panel conversation before we get into questions from the group. So I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to put to the panel and generate some conversation and some thinking for us all. So my first question is to Victor today. Now, Victor, he's literally in the field, joining us from the bonnet of his car, so to speak. So thank you, Victor, for doing that. Victor, what are the lessons that we can learn from Aboriginal fire management, and how might these have changed the outcomes from recent bushfires?
Oh, look, there's so much to learn about Indigenous knowledge and landscapes, and modern society today is not even close to managing the land the way it had been managed for thousands of years. And even to put it in another way, modern society really don't understand how the land has evolved with people for thousands of years and how that links into its identity and its diversity. The more we understand Indigenous knowledge, the more we understand the landscapes, and we also, the more that we're relying on natural intelligence of our environment. It has more than just fire. Indigenous knowledge systems and natural intelligence, where our knowledge comes from, which is the landscape, that's where so much innovation lies and solutions lie. And when we look at, say, just for fire alone, we could make a huge difference simply by looking after the land better. But what that looks like is the problem. People don't understand what that looks like. It's not going around and dressed up in, the Western way of fire management. It's like, if I could show you people walking through the land, combing through the country, and in some states, sometimes we're burning the country 3 times in 1 year, depending on the health and the problems with the land. What it looks like to manage this land in the future, this modern society hasn't seen it yet. And what it looked like before colonization, with people walking through country all the time, and people using country, and people taking care of the landscape and understanding landscapes. So we have a long way to go to getting to that point. And the quicker we get into that, understanding that, and giving Indigenous knowledge the capacity to demonstrate itself, the more value that people are going to see in so many different sectors, from health to education, economics, and then down to obviously looking after our environment into the future. And so that's, we haven't even started, and nature-based solutions really are the way to go.
Thank you, Victor. Glenn, if I can swing over to you now. So you've been doing a lot of work embarking on a process of engagement with the Western Australian government in the Kimberley, and I guess in doing that, what's working and what do you think can be better?
Thanks, Jason, and hello to Victor and Leon as well. I'm just letting people know I'm on Bundjalung country today, not back up in the Western Kimberley, just down on the east coast at the moment. So sort of acknowledge country here on Bundjalung country. So yeah, I mean, I'll frame it around the water more specifically, and Martuwarra, the river, given that, that's our main focus. In terms of what's working, what's starting to work well and what we can do better. I think for us, starting from within our organisation, what our organisation represents is a council or a coalition or an alliance of traditional owner groups throughout the Western Kimberley. And it's actually quite unusual to have an organisation that allows and supports that process to happen, where people can come together outside of specific native title organisations or their PBCs and be together and looking at country as a whole and considering our living waterways as a whole. So that's going really well in terms of the way we're set up our organisation and the way participation's happening. I think what's going well beyond that outside is within the Kimberley, the relationships we're building and continue to, we have and continue to build with those other organisations in the Kimberley, and that includes other First Nations organisations, but also conservation organisations and, local communities. So that's going well in terms, it's a big area. It's a really big geographic area. There's a lot of logistical challenges, just engaging in the local area. In terms of government, I think where, our focus and our kind of priority from, in terms of, I think from a cultural perspective, the way we operate is to build relationships first, to focus on, relationship building with the people we need to work with, the people we want to work with, and, take it from there. So we're starting to see that happening. We've got a couple of projects happening with different departments and particularly with DEWA in WA government. So we're having an opportunity through those projects to build those relationships. And that's really important that we do that before we, sort of talk business and go on and try and do things that might be challenging across those spaces. And I think in doing better, what needs to be done better or what we need to be looking towards is at the end of the day, we really have some challenging legislative issues in WA to deal with or to work with. And one of them being the WA Cultural Heritage Act, which, people may be aware of a lot of the stuff that's gone on around that. In its current form, it's probably worth noting that the UN has determined that, looking at it from a United Nations declaration type human rights perspective, they consider that that legislation to not be adequate in terms of falling short of the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So I think that's really significant. And in terms of water, cultural heritage, cuts across all country and is relevant particularly to our living waterways. I think the other thing we need to, specifically in terms of water in WA, we've got a Water Act that hasn't really been majorly refined or reviewed or upgraded since around 1904. So consider the context, the circumstances, especially for Aboriginal people in Australia and in WA in 1904, and what aspects of any sort of social and cultural justice were built in or considered within that legislation at the time. So we do have a long way to go in terms of developing a shared approach to developing better, more equitable legislation, because I think we need to consider legislation as the foundation of all that. We can have good policies and we can have good agreements and all that kind of thing locally, but at the end of the day, we need solid legislation to fall back on when we look at policy, because that's the foundation of our security in the process.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. That's really good observations there. Leon, I might turn to Leon now. Leon, with the work you do, can you share with us what the extent is of the Indigenous Ranger program across Australia and how they're working with non-Indigenous land and water groups, and in particular, how they're working to integrate with the broader community as well?
Yeah, thank you. And I too would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose lands we all meet today virtually, and acknowledge, I think Glenn said he's up my way. Bunjalung, I'm Gombanga, so you're not far from my country, bud. So I trust the weathers and the people are looking after you up that way. Look, Indigenous Rangers and the IPAs programs, I guess, we're looking at that, how they currently assist First Nations people in managing and caring for their country. They do that, though, in accordance with the traditional owners' objectives. But obviously, a key for us is how that actually works towards contributing to closing the gap. The original Indigenous Rangers program was funded as the Working on Country program back in 2007. And it's been continually funded in various iterations, I guess, since then. And as a lot of people would already know, it is funded through our agency, through the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, and we now have an extension of that program up until the 30th of June 2028. And, the government, I guess we've committed something like an additional $636 million to the Indigenous Ranger Initiative, and that includes the expansion of the Rangers program. So, it brings a fairly significant investment of over, $1.3 billion out to June 28, which I think is great, but it's also a great recognition from my point of view in terms of just the work that our Rangers and IPAs and everybody actually does on the ground. We're not doing this alone because sometimes, there's a perception that we're not talking or listening to First Nations people, but in this role or in this process, we've actually established an Indigenous Ranger reference group. So we have representation of people from across the country. So, they're providing that sort of First Nations-led guidance for us to actually finalise an Indigenous Ranger sector strategy, but also to inform the implementation of the Indigenous Rangers expansion. So a lot happening. Indigenous Rangers, at the moment, they support about I think it's 128 Ranger groups through 79 different organisations that employ around 2,000 Indigenous Rangers, full-time, part-time and casual. And the new expansion certainly has a focus on expanding or improving the number of First Nations women employed. At the moment, it's around 36% of the jobs nationally. The Ranger program funding obviously includes annual indexation, but that's one that we're very clear in terms of being able to support organisations going forward. So the total investment in even just in our Indigenous protected areas to June 28 is also around the $230 million mark. So at this point in time, there's a total of 121 consultations, dedicated NC country IPA projects, 85 dedicated IPAs, and I find this an interesting stat, but they cover around 87 million hectares of land and 5 million hectares of sea country, representing more than 50% of Australia's national reserve system. So for me, I think that just shows or demonstrates the enormity of the land holdings that our people have, but also it demonstrates just how much work there is to do on our own land. The consultation projects, IPAs, include 10 sea country IPAs, and there are currently 12 new and expanding projects being contracted. Approximately 80% of IPAs currently host Indigenous Ranger funded Rangers. And the final stat that I'll just talk about is in 22-23, 709 First Nations people, including 326 women, were employed in casual, part-time or full-time positions, with 793 people employed in total. So it's not a small program, but it's one that's really, I see as being quite effective in terms of that engagement with people on the ground. Look, I've been out and about because I have obviously a number of ranger groups across my region that I cover. So I cover Queensland border down to the Victorian border, including the ACT. So, we've got rangers down in Jervis Bay Territory, in Taree, up the far north coast, So I've actually been able to see them firsthand, and that work with broader communities and local farmers, where they're assisting them to do cultural burns on their properties. They're assisting them where they have waterways running through. So, they're assisting to clean them up to make sure that they're, ecologically, I guess, more viable. But yeah, just the knowledge that they bring and the cultural knowledge, as well as the knowledge that they're learning through relevant educational facilities, is just amazing. And really quite astounding. And there's nothing more refreshing for me to get out of my office here in Parramatta and get out onto country and, go out and see firsthand some of the work that our rangers are doing. And, it's even interesting because here in Sydney, I think we have probably one of the first urban ranger groups in terms of the Gamay Rangers out at La Perouse, who are doing some fantastic things with the university around the seagrass in Botany Bay. So there's a lot of variety, but I think that just demonstrates the enormity and the size of the work and the knowledge of our people right across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Leon. That's really inspiring, and yeah, there's no doubt the IPA program is looked at from around the world as really one of Australia's success stories in the last 20 or 30 years. Absolutely. Just wanted to follow up, Leon. We were talking earlier about how I guess that maybe traditional perspectives. When I say traditional, sorry, not Aboriginal traditional perspectives, but how the broader community might have looked on working on country ranges and IPA ranges as being solely focused on those sorts of activities that you might think about with culture and conservation and pest management and so forth. But that's changing that role, yeah. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, look, I guess where I want to go with this, Jason, is obviously across my patch in the last few years, and then obviously I had some work to do when I was looking after Queensland earlier in the year as well. But whenever there's a catastrophic event, be it a flood, cyclone, bushfire, or anything that's catastrophic, I've often seen our rangers at the forefront as what I refer to as first responders. And they're not only there in that emergency response phase, being able to look after our communities and some of our remote communities, but they have that knowledge, that they have that affiliation with the community, so they're quite well known. So they're able to work to support our communities in times of a crisis. And I guess one of the things that we often see, and it still continues after the bushfires down the far south coast of New South Wales in 2019, is it's that recovery. That work on the ground, working with the communities and the broader community, not just the Indigenous communities, but to revegetate using their local knowledge, to re-engage and work, I guess, more broadly across the whole of the community. In terms of looking at that recovery phase of what a devastating event, and I've seen them all from bushfires to floods, right through to the cyclones that happened up in far north Queensland earlier in the year, and I was just amazed at how our ranger groups in particular came up with ideas, and we were able to support and pivot their current funding arrangements to be actively engaged in responding and supporting communities after a particular event. So yeah, that's my link, I guess my extended view of the role and value of our ranger groups that they add at that local level. Yeah,
thanks for sharing that, Leon. Glenn, I might just jump to you. There's a question that's on my mind a bit, and we had a bit of a chat about it yesterday as well, is you talked before about the links between legislation down to policy and so forth, how important it is to have all of these things line up to be able to actually get on with making meaningful change and having outcomes that flow all the way through. And one thing I wanted to explore with you, if I can, is how do policymakers who are at that legislation policy and as opposed to on ground more closer connect to what's going on, how do they actually enter into, how important is it they enter into clarity about what they're trying to achieve and good faith processes and listen as part of working with communities on whatever they're involved in?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an obvious challenge for a lot of different reasons. I think for a long time across the board in policy, whether it's, you know, looking at cultural heritage protection, environmental, you know, protection, fire in particular, I think is a big one, water use. Yeah, look, I think the only way it's going to change in a sort of meaningful way is coming from two angles. One is much more local engagement, and the inclusion of, you know, in a sense, a more multicultural understanding and valuing when it comes to policy. So, you know, that term culturally and socially just approaches are really important. I think it just requires policymakers to have to come from a more diverse, you know, background themselves, I guess, in terms of who's recruited and supported to be involved in those discussions. But also to give those people, you know, to be fair to those people, to give them opportunities to, for example, come on country and meet people and see things for themselves. And really important for people to get a feel for, you know, what's being talked about, what people are talking about, where they are, and get a feel for that, have an experience on country with those people. And I think from the other end, from that sort of more global thing, I really think Australia, you know, Australian government, and whether it's at national or state level or local level too, it'd be great to see them be more mindful of this international advice and these international perspectives. You know, we do have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and Australia is a signatory to that. And, you know, if we were to really lean into that when we looked at policy and legislation, we'd see some dramatically different outcomes, you know, and again, right across the board, we'd see a lot more, you know, First Nations control and authority over country and what happens. And that would be also, you know, in a sort of much more of a stronger partnership type arrangement. So, yeah, I think, you know, it's all possible. There's actually no barriers to this happening other than people's, you know, where people are in terms of their political will and their own understanding, and, you know, where we are ideologically. So we're a really lucky country in regards to, we do have the resources and, you know, the kind of skill sets amongst people where, you know, we have the money to spend on these things. So we're not sort of stopped from doing that. It's just a matter of broadening what's considered, you know, in that policy, whose cultures, whose values, whose beliefs, and I think that would, you know, all go a long way to making a much more functional process. We really need to avoid this constant, you know, sort of preparing for conflict and having to be in conflict. It's not a cultural value that we hold dear, is conflict. You know, our cultural values are based on inclusivity and, you know, engagement and relationship building, like I said. So it'd be really awesome to move away from that sort of conflict approach, especially around environmental and cultural heritage issues.
No, that's terrific. Thanks, Glenn. And the conversation's definitely getting some questions generated. So mindful the time we've got for questions, I might stop indulging in the questions that I have and move on to the audience questions now. So the first question we've got is from Lara and Victor. That's one that Lara's asked if you could address for us. And the question is, in Western Australia, we often hear what the government is doing about coal burning, but she understands this is very different from cultural burning. And she'd like to have a conversation about how these two processes are different and why cultural burning might be better?
Yeah, it's always been a question. It always comes up. What are the differences between Western burning and and Aboriginal burning techniques? And we've sort of got to be careful. That Indigenous knowledge and opportunity isn't swallowed up too much by like Western ways of and Western frameworks. And I don't say that in a negative way. I say that in a positive way, because we need to be able to have Indigenous knowledge demonstrate itself fully without interference, so that we can see the full benefits, and you can see all the knowledge indicators that can come from that. A lot of programs that I've seen and a lot of people have shown me and I've come across where they're led by non-Indigenous agencies, and like it could be fire departments or whatever, and or national parks, and it just falls under the same rut of how they burn. In Western Australia, I've had a bit of experience with a couple of brothers there and a couple of sisters further north and that, and yeah, there are some like real issues around right across the board, where mobs don't get listened to how they want to do things. That's particularly in the southern areas, particularly down in the south and all those areas. In the north, we have a lot of people doing the carbon approach, which is also different. But at the end of the day, the like for the Indigenous knowledge side of it, or Aboriginal burning techniques, like I said earlier, like it needs to be just given its capacity to demonstrate itself and to be able to show the way it works and the way it needs to work on different landscapes. It's really crucial, because the more we get sucked into a vortex of Western ways of doing things, the more we miss out on information. I mean, we've already suffered from that on the last 50 years to 100 years. We've already suffered where Indigenous knowledge wasn't involved, and down the track, even non-Indigenous people, when fire was excluded, like farmers, a lot of people who had a little bit of knowledge on burning land, all faded away because policies took over. And then at the end, 50 years later, when we get big wildfires, no one knows what to do, because all those people who had knowledge have passed away because the policies have stopped fire for so long. So we have lost a lot of skills because of policies and because of Western structures, and we need to be mindful of that. And that's why I always strive with the work that I do is to allow the knowledge to demonstrate itself fully, and of course inclusively. And I 100% agree with Glenn, like 100%. Like there can't be any conflict. It needs everyone work together. And what people got to realize is that Indigenous fire management and knowledge it's there for the sake of all future generations. It's there for the future of this landscape. It's there to help to stop the wildfires, extinction, and all these problems that we're seeing with country. It's fine detail involved in that, and there's a lot of knowledge involved, and that fine detail can be missed if we just skim over the top and say, look at just life and property. We miss out on all that other stuff and fine detail. So it's crucial that we're getting an Indigenous-led model so that we can see what other benefits are out there, and the fine detail of all the indicators of country, the soils, the plants, the knowledge, the medicines, the foods. All of that fine detail is crucial to understanding the landscape even more intimately. And that's why for the programs for Indigenous land management, I feel personally that we need to be giving it its 100% ability to demonstrate itself outside of interfering agencies or the mainstream. And it needs to be in mainstream as well, and a part of the mainstream. It needs to be a service to this country. That's where it should be. I mean, we've got half our mob looking around for insurances, and that shouldn't be right. Our ranger group should be insured by this government, because they're out there looking after the country for the future generations. That should be a service to this nation, just like ambulance, or just like the other fire departments and so forth. So, giving us the full capacity would be nice. And if there was anything about policies that I would suggest, then it is just to give Indigenous knowledge its full capacity and to support the case studies that are happening as well. So, for example, in some states, we're looking at burning around metro areas and cities, and showing how we can look after people don't have to evacuate their towns. And you shouldn't have to evacuate your town. A town should be a place where you're safe. That's what we call our camp, and our camp is always safe. And so, and there's other things we're doing around agriculture and then our harvesting techniques as well. If you're just given the full capacity, then we'll be able to see a really wonderful resource that can really inspire innovation and new ways of doing things. And let's put it straight, we'll be able to help change policies better if we can get some stark practical outcomes and examples of what works better. In my opinion. Yeah.
No, thanks for that, Victor. Leon, I might jump to you next, and I've got a question that follows up on some of those impressive stats that you shared earlier. The question is, do you know what the breakdown is of who is employing Indigenous rangers through the program? So local, state or federal government, and whether private enterprise is involved as well?
I can follow up and get some more feedback, but my understanding is those stats that I quoted are the local organisations across the whole of the country. So it's the local community organisations that are funded through the Indigenous Ranger program. But I'm happy to take that one on notice. Jason, provide some additional information, or even if the individual wants to contact me directly, happy to have a conversation offline. But yeah, I'm fairly confident that a lot of those stats are related to organisations whom we fund underneath the Indigenous Advancement Strategy.
Yep. Thank you. Another question we've got, and I'll open it up to who from the panel wants to respond or have a conversation about it, is what thoughts you have on which countries are the leaders in linking policy to legislation that is actually aligned with United Nations obligations. So there's that, who are the leaders question, but also what can we learn from those countries?
I don't mind just having a go at starting. I mean, it's a very complex question, because I guess I'm lucky enough to have had to study this a bit and research this a bit informally, and currently working in uni level teaching around this area. But I think it's really important when we look at what's happening now in other countries and what's happening, at a better or more deeper level, at a more socially and culturally just level. It's really critical to understand the historical background in those places too. So a lot of the common ones people will sort of refer to would be Canada and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think what's really important why we tend to look at those places, and because they do have some, I guess, similarity to our own, they're both lands that were colonised by the same mobs. And so I think the big difference, though, is when you look at that history, in both of those places, there was significant treaty making, and there was also recognition at various levels in government of sovereignty too, and the sovereignty of, and as Victor was saying, which translates to, in more practical terms, mob being allowed to do things on country to the fullest extent they can, and being and resourced and supported to do that in partnership with government. So I think it's hard in this time to sort of drop down into specific examples, but I think what comes out is with those examples where things are more when there's a higher level of sustainability to those things, it's ultimately because First Nations people have a stronger sense of authority and control over country. They tend to be better resourced, and so they are able to have longer term planning, and also when you see this in action in places like, in particular places in Canada and New Zealand, there's also a very clear deeper level of kind of normality of that happening in mainstream society across Western society. So the idea of First Nations people being in those roles and being at the forefront of things, managing country, you know, even managing education and other sort of human services in different locations is seen as a typical outcome, you know, something that's part of that social fabric. So I think, you know, it's tricky to just cherry pick examples from those places if we're not going to sort of then, you know, go back and look at the foundation of those things. And really, like I said, the foundation of those things that are more successful and more sustainable is based on a greater level of economic and legal security for First Nations in those places. That's my, you know, sense of it.
Thank you. That's it's a lot for people to think about there, actually. Victor or Liam, is there anything you'd like to add on the question or some of the observations that Glenn's had?
Yeah, I guess yeah, I agree with Glenn there on a legislative sort of point. Like, but you know, we're all in the same boat, like global scale. Like we're all having the same problems. Everything is identical. Like we have the same problems in Canada as in Australia, as in Canada. They have the same struggles still, even though they got good legislation. They still struggle. They still struggle with the government giving them the opportunity to manage landscapes. And the government, in areas that I'm working in Canada, the last 7 years with a couple of communities there, with mentoring there, like, you know, we're struggling to do it the Indigenous way. You know, like many other communities are doing it through rural fire services over there, and they're walking around with Western fire uniforms and that on. The communities I'm working with, we're walking along with normal clothes and we're putting our fires with the fir tree branches. I mean, you know, like we're able, and because of that, we're able to look at all the indicators and knowledge and rebuild knowledge bases and restore knowledge, and that really important process of restoring knowledge. We've got to be careful that the policies and legislations don't override what's really needed on the ground for the landscape and what's needed for the people in the cultural sense as well. Like sometimes it can swallow things up and water things down, you know. So for the communities I'm working with overseas, it's not a benefit at all for them. It's hard for them to continue to do the burns their way and to do it through a cultural way without being interfered by the policies and Western institutions, you know. It's really hard. And the landscape is going through equal problems as our landscape, the extinction rates, the knowledge loss within culturally, even the struggle with a fractured society in different nations across the globe. You know, that fractured society problem is the biggest problem of all. And that's why we have problems with the landscapes, is because of our social structures. And it's really important that people understand that, because we're all have exactly the same problems. It's all same but different, but we're at different points. So when I went to overseas, it was like stepping in a time machine, going back to Australia 20 years ago. And when I first went there, it was like starting all over again. People didn't even know the concept of, you know, Aboriginal fire management and, you know, in a sense of the broader community. I'm not talking about the Indigenous people, the broader ones, and like, you know, the social norm, you know. And it's been rebuilding that whole credibility from that. The problem with the Western fire programs that involve Indigenous stuff and something like the carbon stuff, people look at that straight away, and it's based on climate change, carbon, this and that, and Western science is a lot involved in that and telling communities how to burn and when to burn, and they start to influence other countries, you know. So really, for me, it's about letting Indigenous people do that in a way that is thorough and is done in a way where you know, we're not doing a Western program, but we're actually trying to rebuild our knowledge bases on country and rebuild the right practice for each different landscape and how we're able to do that. But you know, in Australia, yeah, we have a lot of opportunity, even though we're behind legislation-wise, and like for other countries, like the community I work with in Canada, the government can't interfere with them, but they still do. And with burning the land. So when I landed there, they put a fire ban out then the government put a complete fire ban when they found out I landed in over there. And I went to the chief there. I said, "Hey, they got a fire ban on. What are we gonna do? I've come, you know." And they reckon, "Oh no, just go ahead. This is our land. We will tell you how to house. You know, it's our country, our governance. You just go ahead." So I went ahead and we continued to burn. But even so, that was the case. They were getting inundated by the environmental agencies and police and pressured and still being pressured now, trying to pull down their programs. I mean, legislation, all that is one thing, but you really need to get a strong regions. And I really believe in setting examples by working with regions on the ground and setting practical examples. And I think that's really important because on a global scale, we're pretty much in the same boat and the same progress. And we're also declining at the same rate too.
Wow. That's pretty full on, hey? Glenn, I've got a specific question for you about how the council is protecting and managing the Martuwarra Fitzroy River from water extraction practices. And the question is the council interested in getting personhood rights for the river like in New Zealand?
Two big questions. Yeah, right now it's a live issue in WA, in the Kimberley right now with water extraction. So generally speaking, the WA government has committed to not extracting water from the surface water, so essentially from the river and its connecting, waterways. But that's not a very simple thing either, because it's not the case with groundwater. So the Canning Basin, it's one of the largest groundwater sources globally. It's a huge groundwater source, and currently the science, the understanding from a Western perspective of where that groundwater even comes from and the volumes that are there and what's the impact of extracting that isn't thoroughly known. And that's, the WA government are the first to admit that the science, as compared to that Indigenous knowledge, which is around the custodianship of that water and the relationship with that water, and basically the fact that our role is to maintain the integrity of that water in its fullest sense and in its most complete sense. So, large-scale extraction from a First Nations and First Law perspective is off the cards in general. So looking at the pressure at the moment, there is a kind of a sense of a draft policy, and there is live licensing going on. It's pretty alarming when you look at the volumes of water that are being suggested to be extracted and what's being considered for licensing. It goes above and beyond any need that's currently up there in terms of it's mainly pastoral, pretty much 100% pastoral, and some very small agriculture around pastoral activity. So at the moment, in terms of what we can do, we're a very small organisation, so our role is heavily around engagement with others at a community level. As Victor said, we're all in it together. So, what happens in the Kimberley impacts on everyone in the Kimberley, but also outside the Kimberley and globally. This is water, we're talking about, most fundamental need we have. So, our role is really about, our role is to make sure that the message is coming from that First Nations perspective around the importance of that water. And looking at as much allyship and collaboration we can support, and then I guess beyond that, when things beyond that, we will look at how we work politically, in terms of resisting those levels of extraction, particularly when they're not scientifically justified. In terms of it's a bit. It's pretty rich to come into a place and talk about extracting huge volumes of water without really understanding the process of that water. And, that's just the sort of Western science. We, as I talked about before, there's the cultural there's the First Nations relationships to that water and the values and the issues around the well-being of First Nations people and country that is dependent on that water. So in terms of in terms of how we, how that moves forward, it's, this is early days in that process, but we can see, it's happening in the Northern Territory as well. So it's a huge issue with potential extraction. So, yeah, it's something that, sorry, what was the second part of that question there? I just want to make sure I've covered it off properly.
Yeah, the second question was around, is the council interested in getting personhood rights for the river like in New Zealand?
Well, it does have personhood rights already. Those rights exist from a first law perspective. So we recognise, and all the mob right around the Kimberley, and I'd say right around Australia, recognise the river as a living being, as our as an ancestor. And so it has those rights within our first law system, which needs to be absolutely respected and understood. That's part of the sort of best practice of developing these policies. We can't just have one side's values and one side's beliefs, and then that being sort of us being taken into account on just on the edge of that as a sort of bit of an equity and diversity kind of issue. So it already is recognised. It's up to, from a Western framework, we've seen that roll out in different parts of the world, and I think it'd be hard to comment on how effective that is, because those places have their own legislative and governance relationships to that giving a natural entity like the river that kind of identity. I think it's really early days, and I think it's not as it sounds initially. For example, giving a river or a forest, that sense of human rights, but I think we can respect it for what it is and who it is, without having to make it a person. One of the challenges of once you do that, again within the Western system, you can create potential conflict. So if something has rights, it also has responsibilities. So now in some of those places where rivers, for example, are given rights, people are now talking about they're going to sue the river for, because the river's a responsible being. And so, if it floods us or if this and that happens, we'll sue the river. So it's, it becomes quite a little bit more complicated than people imagine. And so maybe just engaging the first law practices and empowering that system is the better way to do it. But I think it's an important discussion, and it highlights the significance of recognition and the need to protect things as powerfully as possible. So I think it's a discussion we should be having.
No, that's brilliant, and people will probably be aware of some of the conversations been had here in South Australia around Cuddy Thunder Lake Air in a similar way with how we care for and manage that lake surface to respect Arabana wishes. So everything you've said there, Glenn, certainly resonates. We've got one more question we might squeeze in, and this is from Tracy, and she's asked a question about. And I'll open this up, and Leon, you might want to jump in on this one as a starter. But what do you see as the best strategies for non-Indigenous people to support and work with Indigenous people in these significant change processes, particularly when there are so few experts in this field to be able to do that?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to dive in. To be honest, it starts firstly with a conversation. From my own experience, there are a lot of non-Indigenous people, groups, communities, organisations out there that want to engage in Indigenous affairs, but for some reason or other, they're a little bit too scared to sort of make that first approach. But we know that for First Nations people in particular, we can't do some of this work on our own. We do need some of the assistance and support of of other groups that are out there and being able to support us. My mind often wanders back to someone like Peter Yu when I hear him talk about our assets that we have. And I say our assets as a collective. I'm not a traditional owner, but, I talk in terms of our, because I see our people across the whole of the country and the assets that they have. I often hear Peter talking about how do we activate those assets. We're in a much better position these days. I had a catch up with Peter a few weeks ago, and he said, he thinks that we're at a serious crossroad in being able to activate those assets. And, we always hear the comment that, we're asset rich, but cash poor in our communities. But I think by bringing other people into the conversation, then, it certainly opens it up. I guess the key to that, though, is how our mob across the country still maintain control and look at how they can, garner that support. But I think it starts with a conversation.
Thank you, Leon. Victor or Glenn, is there anything you'd like to add in that space?
I guess it's all about relationships, but it's also about getting people to understand that it's about everyone. It's about all of us, and it's about the future of the landscape. And the way that can be articulated is by through the work that we do, is we show the benefits to the landscape, but also show the benefits to the other stakeholders in the region. And it's important that you are showing the benefits to everybody, not just one person or just one thing. And just to think this is only going to benefit us and not that fella. Well, that's a linear way of thinking, and that's a colonized way of thinking. The way that you need to be doing things is what you do there needs to benefit everything. And when people see that, they see themselves in what you're doing, and they see how even the damage they've done on the land from their past practices if they're not Indigenous. And they also see the importance of working together, and that can only come with practical demonstration in landscapes. And there's so much that we're doing that involves everyone, and everything we do now involves every stakeholder, and everyone needs to be investing in looking after the land through the Indigenous lens. And when we're actually doing that, we're bringing everyone on board. And that's what needs to happen. We can't be separated and we can't be segregated. And if you look at even the partial industries and a lot up this way and other areas, the country's closing up on them. Their businesses are getting less because of woody thickening, or they're losing their grasses and pastures. And that's just one example. But and now we're working with some of them to restore all that country and to get it back to really healthy landscapes. And they're learning that they don't need to use poisons, and they're learning that they don't that they need to put the trees back and not clear the trees away. And they're learning that fire is a good way to support restoring and healing landscapes as well. And so they can see the benefit. And then the other benefit is that we're getting to look at country we've been locked out of for generations. And because the partials finally let us on the land instead of pointing a gun at us, And so now they're letting us on the land, and we're able to see places. So my Uncle Russell saw places for the first time in his 70s, because we're working more differently way of thinking, of being more inclusive and showing how we can benefit our stakeholders and not just keep it to ourselves. And the more that we open up like that and more inclusive, and this goes back to what Glenn was saying before, no conflict, but being inclusive and showing how you benefit everybody, that's what needs to happen, because we need to heal our social structures. And to heal our social structures, we need to show really good examples of working together and how we have shared benefits and shared co-benefits that come from the one place of taking good care of our country.
Yeah. Thanks, Victor. That's a really great way to wrap it up today. So I'd like to thank yourself and Leon and Glenn for participating in today's panel discussion. Lots of wise observations and calls to arms almost for things that people should be thinking about at all levels there. So So thank you again. And for the viewers, I'd like to let you know that you'll receive a post-event email with a link to a recording of today's session, which will be available on CEDA's website in about 1 week's time. And please stay in touch with upcoming discussions via ceda.com.au, where you can also register for CEDA's upcoming live streams, of which there are 2. One on Wednesday, the 28th of August, which is about ESG COPB Forum, AI for ESG and ESG for AI. And then on Thursday, the 5th of September, Global Matters Driving Critical Change in Australian Cities. So thank you all again for joining in to today's panel discussion, and wish everyone a safe and happy weekend.